Last week we talked about the kind of consciousness which we're all too familiar with, from which we're trying to be saved. I'd like to move on to another type of consciousness, but do it through a specific approach, which is inspired by my experience of this past week. Last Friday, after our last sitting, the day after our last sitting, I buried my first pastor from St. Joseph's in the Village. He was 86 years old. He had 3 months of slow-moving leukemia, and he seemed relaxed. And so it was not really traumatic. On the other hand, today I buried my other pastor, who had less than a month between diagnosis and death, pancreatic cancer. He was only 70 years old, which is young for priests, or for anybody really nowadays. Now he was also, I had in an email exchange with him barely 10 days ago, in which he was radiantly ready, trusting in the love of Jesus, within our Christian tradition. So it wasn't tragic in that sense interiorly, but it certainly is startling, and it wakes us up to the fact that anything can happen anytime to anybody, and we don't know how much time we have. As we chant at the end of our meditation every week, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunity is lost. This night your days are diminished by one, so do not squander your life. It's also a time to meditate on the phenomenon of death and what kind of consciousness we should bring to it, but also what kind of consciousness it would seem it leads to. And there obviously is a connection. As if that weren't enough, even before I had found out about my second pastor's death, I had made reservations to visit for the first time the 9/11 Memorial Museum. That isn't a meditation on death, unexpected death, and I don't know what is. Of course, it's very moving. But there's a very splendid avenue here within the Buddhist tradition, the Zen tradition, which is mirrored in the museum, for us to approach this mystery. At home, and I may have shown you this before, I have one of the watercolors of Amy Yeet, assistant of Roshi Kennedy, and his calligraphy. And this is a saying of Dogen, who most of you know is the founder in the 13th century of Zen Buddhism in Japan. And the quote is called "boundless." The quote is, "The true person is not anyone in particular, but like the deep blue color of the limitless sky, it is everyone, everywhere in the world." And I love the drawing because you have birds flying in two different areas of blue. They're actually flying over the sea, it looks like, here, and then the sky here. But even when they're flying over the sea, it looks like it could be the sky. So it's all just different shades of blue to express the notion of boundlessness and, of course, the notion of flying, the experience of flying. So once again, the true person, beyond life and death, the true person is not anyone in particular, but like the deep blue color of the limitless sky, it is everyone, everywhere in the world. And, believe it or not, if you visited the museum, or if you do, you'll see this. Right as you enter the main part of the museum, there's a quote from Virgil about never forgetting this day. But there's a little diagram, a little picture of it here. There are 2,983 squares of blue right on the wall, commemorating each one of the persons who died. And each is a different shade of blue. And the title of the work is Trying to Remember the Color of the Sky on a September Morning. So we're taking the sky, those of you who know, I was there, it was a beautiful blue sky that day. Each person is commemorated as a limitless blue sky of a different color. Each one has its own particular color, but it's all the blue sky. And it's exactly what Dogen said. So I thought that was amazing. But that's what death is. It's not only what the person is, but it's the person beyond life and death, the boundless consciousness. But not only Christianity, but Buddhism clearly speaks about. This idea of vast, boundless sky is an image that comes up a lot in Zen for the consciousness that we achieve beyond limitations of life and death. So that's who we are, as opposed to what we were talking about last week, this constant smoke and mirrors. That is who we really are, and that's what death reveals. So you see, it's, as we'll see more in a moment, death is not the end of consciousness, it's the opening of consciousness. I once read a book called Zen Physics, in which a scientist who was also a Zen practitioner spoke about, here we are, and this comes up through in a book called The Conversations with God too, here we are limited in our consciousness by our brain, and our physicality, and our senses, which are beautiful and fine, and again, the gateway to enlightenment. But far from consciousness being an epiphenomenon of the brain, something which is just a result of brain activity, it's kind of like restricted in our body, in our brain. Same way they say, for example, that the soul is not in the body's in the soul, which is much bigger, which is the correct way to see it. Same with consciousness. Consciousness is much bigger, and it's just kind of stuffed into this little bottle that we call our physical and psychological being. That's what this book was saying, so that when we're liberated, in a sense it is a liberation from our space and time capsule, then we have full consciousness, what we call Christ consciousness, Buddha nature, boundless blue sky, which is everyone and everything. And notice, Zen would agree with this. Different color blue, I mean, each one maintains, the individuality is not lost, but it's still all part of the blue sky. And we've talked about, I've talked about death before with some of the koans, Tosetsu's barriers, for example, in the Mamonkan, and even the resurrection of the body is being part of it, because all reality is included here. Zen would, Mahayana Buddhism would say that all the dimensions of reality are included, what we call a new heavens and a new earth. But I want to focus today on this aspect of consciousness. There are some books out that have been very popular, and some have been made into movies about experience consciousness beyond death. One called Proof of Heaven by the neurosurgeon, I should say, Ibn Alexander, a Jewish man, which purports to give his experience while he said there was no brain activity and he had this kind of vision of heaven, or experience of heaven as he expressed it. Or the movie and the book Heaven is for Real by Todd, getting the name now. Burpo, yeah. About his son who was 4 years old or 6 years old and also had an near-death experience and had visions of heaven. Now, these are rightly criticized, I would say. People like Sam Harris in his new book about waking up, spirituality beyond religion. The images there are a little strange. They're kind of like being on a trip, on an acid trip. And I think Ram Dass, the great Hindu mystic who began with LSD, as you may know, his phrase which says that the whole Bible, or all the imagery of Revelation or of heaven that we often use, or this picture here, is one big astral trip. In other words, everything that's happening here, because it's not death yet, in any of these cases, everything here is still encapsulated within imagery. It's not what the ultimate experience is. So take it as a style of certain level of consciousness, if you will, maybe a Buddhist heaven, or what's pictured in, but it's not the ultimate boundless experience of what is actually like. So, what is that? Well, indicating it. But I'd like to use as our guide here the same man I used last week, Eckhart Tolle, in The Power of Now. And he, at one point in the book, he speaks about conscious death, this process of dying, so that it does open out in this way. Remember, he mentions various traditions for these basic experiences. He does speak about this more in terms of the Tibetan Book of the Dead here, of the people who've had near-death experiences with a portal of radiant light. They speak of a sense of serenity and deep peace. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, he says it's described as the luminous splendor of the colorless light of emptiness. Emptiness being the whole. It can't be characterized by anything, so it's empty. Luminous splendor of colorless light. So here is no color. But it's splendor, and it's luminous. Which it says, the Book of the Dead says, is your own true self. So the same basic image, boundless splendor, being your true self. The true self. Capitals. But as he points out, and as the Tibetan Book of the Dead points out, if you're not ready for it, if you don't recognize it as you, if it isn't you, you pull back. It's plausible enough. We would say in Christianity you fall back into purgatory. Whatever. But you don't recognize it as you. You don't have the perfect union with Christ consciousness, if you will, or the Buddha nature. So most people carry too much residual resistance, too much fear, and then they lose consciousness and fall back. And most of what happens after that is involuntary and automatic. If you follow that Tibetan Book of the Dead idea of coming back into this world. This is Eckhart now. Your radiant true nature remains, but not the personality. So what of us is left? If our personality, our individuality is so much tied to imagination and memory and our physicality as we know it in space and time, what is left? He puts it this way, and I've always wrestled with this and thought it very insightful. Whatever is real, or of true value in your, quotes, personality, is your true nature shining through. So that's not lost. This is never lost, as he says. Nothing that is of value, nothing that is real, is ever lost. Now that's consoling and puzzling at the same time, because, well, what is real and what isn't lost? Whatever is your true nature shining through. Well, what is that? Well, you'll find out. But I think that's a good way of putting it. It's not just one big monism, but on the other hand, it has to be real. He says, as all the great masters say, my yoga master who died at the age of 52, he said the same thing, that the dissolution of the physical form is always a great opportunity for spiritual realization. This opportunity is tragically missed most of the time. Master Choa, my yoga teacher, used to say, there should be such tranquility around a dying person, such providing the right atmosphere, the right context for the person to really let go, because that's what's required here, really letting go, a surrender to something bigger, which is what we should be doing when we're sitting here, which is what we should be doing in everything we do in the world. We should always be surrendering to something bigger, so that we're dying before you die, as Richard Rohr others say. Die before you die, by surrender. It's tragically missed most of the time, since we live in a culture that is almost totally ignorant of death, as it is almost totally ignorant of anything that truly matters. But I love this final paragraph of this section. Every portal is a portal of death. In other words, every real opportunity is an opportunity to die and rise, to use Christian language, to die to our false self and rise to our true self. The death of the false self, he says. When you go through it, you cease to derive your identity from your psychological, mind-made form. I'm this. But you're just defining yourself. It's not who you are. It's just words. You then realize that death is an illusion. Just as your identification with form was an illusion. It doesn't mean it's not real or that it's false. It just means it's not ultimately real. It's not your true self. It's provisional. The end of the illusion. That's all that death is. Or as someone else put it very well, death is the illusory end to an illusory form. That's worth meditating on. He ends by saying, it is painful only as long as you cling to illusion. Death is painful. I don't mean physically, you may be physical suffering, but death itself as a personal phenomenon, as a personal event, is painful only if you cling to illusion, which is what most people do. I can't let go of this me. Well, you have to be letting go of it moment by moment. And then when time comes, it'll be a liberation. He has a section towards the end that speaks about the way of the cross, the suffering, its dying. He makes a really good point, which I've already indicated. He says, contrary to what the Buddha tried to overcome suffering, all this false stuff, the suffering that we cause of ourselves, most of the suffering that we cause ourselves. If you're at all awake, we realize. But in Christianity, we've sometimes given the impression that it's the suffering itself which is redemptive, suffering itself which gets us through. As Richard Rohr says, great love or great suffering can wake us out of the false self, the illusory ego, and wake us up to something more, of connection, connectedness. Great love, obviously, but also great suffering. But it's not the suffering itself, and in a sense, it's almost not the love itself. It's the surrender that goes along with it. The surrender of the ego, the letting go of your limited self, and being vulnerable and open, connected, love, suffering, to everything. It's the surrender that's important. It's the surrender that opens up the portal, not the suffering itself. We don't, in our tradition, we've not made that distinction clear enough. As if the suffering itself, the more I suffer, the more reward I'll get. No. It's just the opportunity to wake up, to let go of your ego and your anxious concerns, and let go into something bigger. It's a trust. So he makes that important. He says, I don't call it finding God, because how can you find that which was never lost? You're just waking up to the God that's already there, that you're connected to, that you are, really. God is being itself. So how can you be separated from that? You just wake up to it. He says, the amazing and incomprehensible fact is not that you can become conscious of God, but the fact that you are not conscious of God. That's what's amazing. How can we be so caught up in our nonsense that we're not aware of God? That's what's amazing. Not the fact that we are conscious of God, but the fact that we're not. My yoga teacher always used to say, God is as real to me as the nose on my face. That's what should be the case. Each of us should be able to say that. So he says, the way of the cross is a complete reversal. It means that the worst thing in your life, your cross, your death, if you will, in a certain sense, turns into the best thing that ever happened to you. Like the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. By forcing you into surrender, into death. Forcing you to become as nothing. to become as God. Because God too is no thing. So when you're nothing, as John of the Cross says, that's when you discover God, because God is nothing too. He's emptiness. It's not only the Buddhists, but the Jewish Kabbalists say. All right? So when you surrender and become nothing, that's when you become everything. Emptiness. The Buddhists have it right when they call it that. And he speaks about the unconscious majority of humans and what it would be for the whole world to wake up, and then be predicted, it'd probably be preceded by vast upheavals, he says, which is exactly what the Book of Revelation predicts. Which, remember, is an astral trip. It's not to be taken literally as metaphor. Mm-hmm. But he does mention that here. But he says there's a growing number of humans today who are waking up. So you don't need pain anymore to wake you. How much more time do you think you will need before you're able to say, I will create no more pain, no more suffering? How much more pain do you need before you can make that choice? And he says, if you think you need more time, you'll get more time. And more pain. Time and pain are inseparable. That's very profound. Time and pain are inseparable. When you're beyond time, you're beyond pain. And one final thing. He speaks about the coming of, as I say, the coming of Christ. Second coming, you know, which is part of all this communal waking up. Find it here. Yeah. The second coming of Christ is a transformation of human consciousness. I repeat, that is hugely important. The second coming of Christ is a transformation of human consciousness. It's not some event of somebody coming on a cloud. That's a metaphor. A shift from time to presence. From thinking to pure consciousness. Not the arrival of some man or woman. If Christ were to return tomorrow in some externalized form, what could he or she possibly say to you other than this? I am the truth. I am divine presence. I am eternal life. I am within you. I am here. I am now. So wake up. So what are we afraid of? And who's afraid?